Peter is a vice president at the Center for Global Enterprise at Georgia Tech. He's got a great background. Actually, one thing about the CG, it's a private nonprofit organization. It was actually founded by the former CEO of IBM. And prior to joining CG, Peter had a bunch of experience at GE. In fact, at one point, he was responsible for their global corporate strategy and was responsible for their centers of excellence for fuels, policy, carbon, and strategic workforce planning. And Peter also has a PhD from MIT, so I think he's got some interesting comments for us here today on the rise of energy intelligence. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here today. Thank you very much, Sanjoy, for the invitation. There's two reasons I'm here. One is that I really believe in this space. I think it's part of a megatrend that's happening. And the second reason is to better understand it. I'm trying to wrap my head around a few things. I'm writing an article right now around the rise of energy intelligence, so I'm looking forward to the dialogue and learning more about what's happening in this space. So what I'd like to do is just briefly describe the Center for Global Enterprise. It's a brand new think tank founded by the former CEO of IBM, and it's dedicated to understanding enterprise transformation. Well, Sam Palmisano was the chair and CEO of IBM. He led a transformation of IBM from what he called the multinational to the globally integrated enterprise. And I think there's some themes around energy and energy intelligence that are deeply connected to enterprise transformation, and I'll lay that out. We've just announced our research agenda, and we're partnering with Stanford University, the Stern School of Business at NYU, University of Texas at Dallas, and Georgia Tech on a variety of very interesting projects. And Palmisano also just released an ebook describing his tenure at IBM and what he sees as some of the challenges related to enterprise transformation for big globally engaged companies. I've been in the energy business for probably about 30 years now. My family built 2 small hydroelectric power plants in New Hampshire back in 1980. So we were part of that PURPA wave, the very beginning of the independent power movement. And I've been fascinated with and been following energy ever since. And we find that energy has been a critical element in defining every decade. You go back to the 1970s, obviously the oil shocks, big impact on both economy and in politics. You look at the 1990s with deregulation, with Reagan-Thatcher revolution, and thinking about how do you drive efficiency into important industries like airlines and energy. And then you move into the 2000s, huge global discussion around climate change. So the question is where are we now? And so what I'd like to map out for you is what I think are 3 elements that are shaping this next decade. And these include what I call the age of networks, and I'll walk through that. The digital age, and we've heard a number of speakers talk about that, and I'm going to delve into a number of elements of that. And then finally, enterprise transformation. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. So, age of networks. We live in an era in which energy is really connected with networks. And this is particularly true in gas. This shows the gas pipelines, and in fact, this whole attention to the resource that has been discovered in the United States has really been enabled by the fact that there was an existing pipeline network in which that new supply could get to customers. Other countries, you can see China, very nascent network, not as much developed, and so they actually have, according to some estimates, even more gas reserves than the United States. However, they have a hard time getting it to market because they don't have the infrastructure. So building out those networks is very important. We've seen a transformation not only of physical pipeline networks, but also the connectivity that's happened around the sea. This is a map showing forecasts of what the LNG trade is going to look like in 2020. Estimate that, this comes from a paper that I wrote when I was at GE called The Age of Gas and the Power of Networks. By 2020, estimate 42 buying countries and 25 selling countries. That's up from 12 buyer countries and 12 seller countries in 2000. So we're seeing a tremendous growth in the density of these networks around gas. What's also really interesting is that networks that weren't really connected are now beginning to look at how they can get better connected. In one area it's really interesting is the connection between the gas system and the transportation system. The rail system had absolutely nothing to do with the gas industry, but now they're beginning to see that there's real potential in lowering their costs. And in fact, some estimates done, and this comes from work that CSX has done, to look at what would strategically located liquefaction plants do in terms of investment of about $15 to $20 billion. They believe it could displace about 30% of the current diesel transport fuel. So linking networks has become a big theme going forward. And we see that, I think, looking at the United States and what's happening, I've begun to think of the United States as actually a network superpower. When we look at other countries, relative to other countries, this narrative of the US infrastructure falling apart, I think, is a misnomer. We actually have a better, more robust, and denser network than any other country in the world. What we need to do is, I think, is build linkages between these networks. And we're seeing that happen. I think one of the reasons we have this group in this room is to figure out how do we link this digital infrastructure that's grown up with mobility, with fiber, with the existing physical infrastructure of gas and electricity, and then you can add others like transportation. So I think that's the next wave that's happening in this next decade, is figuring out business opportunities to link these networks, and then these have lots of interesting also economic and social benefits, because if you can optimize this, you can drive greater productivity and efficiency, which has both business benefits as well as environmental and social benefits. So my first theme is the age of networks, thinking about where you sit in those networks, how those networks operate, and then their interconnectivity between those networks. Then we move to the digital age. Fascinating things that are happening with relating to the cost of sensors dropping in the digital networks and infrastructure that's been built out that allows you to not just play with social media and e-commerce, but really move into the industrial system. And so I think this next decade is really going to see tremendous strides in instrumenting big machinery around the world, extracting that data, analyzing it, moving it to the locations where it can be processed, and then getting it back to those networks and to the people and decision makers that can make better decisions based on that. So, and this is, I think, a virtuous circle that the better the data is, the better the decisions you can make. And so that's a really exciting space. We're at the cusp, we're at the front end of this. The world's going to look very different in 2025 as this rolls out, but it's happening today. This is all the power plants in the world. So this comes from the Platts database, and I use a software package called Tableau, which I love. And you don't see this picture very often because the reality is this is pretty fragmented. We have different owners, but that's the sum total. And I think the promise of digital is to help overcome some of these impediments that are established through institutional arrangements. And so you can bridge some of those things, and you can create interconnections, you can drive efficiencies, and you can overcome some of the impediments that has made it difficult to optimize this fleet and transform it. And this happens at several levels. It happens, actually I don't have it on here, but it happens actually down to the component level. Then you go up to the machine level. Then you have the facility, the facility level, which would be a large integrated factory or power plant. Then you have the fleet level, right? So, utility has multiple assets or power plants, so that fleet view. Transportation, you've got all of the trucks or locomotives, and then you get up to the network level. And it's this connection in between these that I think there's tremendous power to drive optimization of what really drives our global economy. So these power plants are essential for a modern way of life, and figuring out how to improve the asset productivity of that fleet is a huge challenge, but it's a huge opportunity as well. And it's going to transform work. It's fascinating to me that most people don't think about these guys, but they're the ones that are out there maintaining it. They're almost like the car mechanics for the fleets, right? And they're the ones that go out to these sites, but the costs of the inefficiencies in the existing systems, these guys actually, most of them still lug out paper documentation to understand the procedures that they follow when they do a downtime on these plants. That's going to change over the next decade with huge, interesting opportunities. So, for example, in the old system, this guy may have an innovation about how to fix that plant faster or better, and but he's dealing with a paper manual, and so he may tell his buddies that he's working with about his innovation, and it may percolate out through the system, but it's going to take a long time. And if you're operating a global fleet of these plants, that's going to take forever. It may take actually the next generation of equipment to get the new field service manuals. If you digitize this, he can be on a wiki, he can share that information, it's instantaneously shared across the entire organization. So there's tremendous power in digitizing these. And in fact, I think we're also going to see virtual reality and then things like Google Glass actually maybe even be deployed faster in some of these areas because the productivity gains are much greater than having people on the street walk around with these things. And so I think businesses are looking. I know really interesting things happening already in the oil and gas space to deploy some of these technologies. So that worker isn't going to go away. You know, we talk about digital replacing people. He's essential to making this happen. However, a lot of these technologies are going to enable what he does and do it better and faster. There was a discussion earlier about solar and how solar is really rolling out. And everybody talks about panel costs, right? And that's dropping. What they don't talk about as much, but I think is a huge component of why this industry is really rolling out faster and will continue to do so, is the digitization of this industry. So and it's actually popped up in San Francisco because you have all of these platform companies out there. And what they're doing is they're capturing satellite data. They've got proprietary software. They get a request from a homeowner or commercial building for a quote. These guys don't have to go out to the facility. They don't have to do a truck roll. They can actually look at that facility. They have high quality mapping. They can look at the telemetry, the orientation, and they can come up within 24 hours at a firm quote. They also don't own the panels, so they can go out to the supply chain and pick the cheapest one. They also don't have vertically integrated upstream, so they can go out and bid out the best and cheapest installers, and so they've become integrators for this industry. And I think this is another area which is driving down the cost and will continue to do so. So that's really been enabled by the digital world, and so this wasn't possible 10 years ago, but today it is. Another interesting example is big macro analysis of cities. Um, there's some interesting parallels between energy and healthcare. If you look at the healthcare industry, you find that about 15 to 20% of the people are responsible for a large percentage of the healthcare costs. When you look at building efficiency, it turns out that in cities, it's about 15 to 20% of the buildings are the big problem. In the old days, utilities would run kind of these broad brush DSM programs. Today, with big data analytics, you can go in and know which buildings are really the problem, and you can do much more targeted interventions, which are much more efficient, and it really spending your money where you can. So there's a lot of promise in leveraging this, and as we know, the world is moving more and more to cities, and so understanding that building stock and how to make it more efficient. You mentioned this morning about the announcement in New York about driving city efficiency, and so these are huge opportunities to improve the building stock of where we live. There are also really interesting innovations on the micro side. Um, there was a realization that you don't have to outfit a building with a bunch of sensors. Every one of us in this room is a sensor. We can feel the ambient temperature. We know how comfortable we are or not. And now there is, with the smart devices, a means of capturing your specific insights into how you feel about being in that building. Huge potential to roll this out on a company basis. It could be done by government agencies to engage their employees in a new way to capture that information. And you can see what they do here. It's almost like Tinder for how you feel about the building you're in. And then they can draw these very interesting maps of how people feel about being in that building. And there's a lot of really good research that shows that your comfort level is tied to your productivity. So if you're in an uncomfortable place, your productivity goes down. If you're in a more comfortable place, your productivity goes up. And so the problem with the building managers, they only hear about a few complaints. This is a way to capture a broader base of information and know exactly where to go and target to make those employees feel better, and you get more out of them. So this holds tremendous potential, and you don't have to outfit the whole building with sensors. You've already got them in that building. This is an area that I've gotten really interested in, but I don't fully understand how it's going to play out, and that has to do with the marriage between the energy industry and this emerging app economy. And so we begin to see companies now that are following the model of what Apple and Amazon and others have done with these app stores. And in the industrial space, companies like Johnson Controls are experimenting with apps that are targeted at energy managers and others. And so increasingly, services delivered over digital are being packaged as apps. And so how this evolves, I think, is a really interesting space. We need to better understand it and the potential for it, not only on the opportunity side, but also on the barrier side. And there may be some public policy impediments to this as well that may be interesting to explore so that this can really flourish. Because I think thinking about how you build and harness the app economy to drive energy efficiency is really, really interesting. And we're going to see a shift where the industrial players are going to begin to wake up and say, some of the stuff they've been doing on the consumer side is really interesting. We got to apply it in the industrial space, and the impacts are potentially huge. Finally, let me go big picture to the transformation of the enterprise. And before I talk about today, I'd like to go back and to show that there has been always an interest in driving the productivity of firms. This was recently discovered in the Library of Congress. It was drawn over 160 years ago by an engineer who was trying to optimize his organization. Does anybody know what this is a map of? Nobody's seen this before. It's really brilliant. This is actually was done by a guy named McCollum, and he was trying to optimize the railroad system. This was one of the very first railroads that was built in the United States, and he had the advantage of that they had just introduced the telegraph. And so he was marrying telegraph information with his network, and he built out this amazing diagram to basically look at where his people were for a couple of reasons. One, he wanted to reduce accidents. There were accidents happening, to better optimize his people within the organization. And so this is, an example of 150 years. So I think that relentless interest and drive, and it's one of the reasons that we have innovation, is to improve that productivity. And we're seeing it now today. So this is a snapshot of the world's 500 largest firms. And the scale is truly phenomenal. The largest 500 firms in the world generate revenues of $31 trillion. Now, what I don't have here, and maybe Urjanet can help me, is how much energy do they consume? Because even if we could shave 0.5% off of that, when I can guarantee you there's a lot of inefficiency in how these companies manage their energy operations, the amount of energy inputs that they have, the opportunities are tremendous. And you can look at the assets. These companies manage $123 trillion worth of assets. So you're talking about plant, equipment, buildings, rolling stock, all sorts of things. And so really trying to figure out how you harness some of the innovations that we're talking about today and apply it in this space, I think, is tremendous. And it's one of the reasons I think this is a mega trend. So going back to this idea of enterprise transformation, we're finding that in the research we're doing at the Center for Global Enterprises is that you establish an enterprise structure based on the conditions of that period, right? And so we had the rise in this last century of what we called the multinational company, right? And this is a company that established overseas presence, and they often replicated their presence at home, right? So you have your plant and equipment, but you also have your legal teams, your HR teams, and everything like that. But that's an inefficient way of operating your business. And so we're beginning to see more and more firms try to become more and more globally integrated. And that's the mission of what we're working on, is to work with CEOs to help them understand Where are the opportunities to transform their companies from multinational to globally integrated? And there's a number of dimensions, and I won't go into this in great detail, but you can improve value through specialization, proximity to customers, your integrity and branding. You can drive greater scale, scope across countries, your flexibility, and then how do you drive your global competitiveness? What I'm interested in doing is building out the energy dimension to this and figuring out through harnessing better data, understanding the networks that you exist in, how do you harness the promise of big data to drive productivity and the global integration of your firm, taking into account the energy dimension. This is a notional map, but what I'd love to be able to do is to map the energy network of these big firms, because the ability to visualize, to help the CEO understand what is their energy network, I think is very powerful, because this often gets relegated down to the supply chain and procurement people. We need to bring it up to become a core strategic part of how businesses are operated. And I think through visualizing the energy network, showing that transition from user to cost data is critically important, and help the senior management understand that their reliance on multiple energy sources, each one of these markets have different dynamics. How does that feed into your overall portfolio? The fact that you have this incredibly fragmented billing process, and I'm talking those 500 firms that I'm talking about often operate in more than 100 countries. David mentioned that there are 5,000 utilities in the United States. Can you imagine expanding that? You're multiplying that also by the numbers of countries that you're dealing with. And so if we can use data to capture and be able to overcome some of these, I think the benefits are tremendous. And the fact that we're dealing with incomplete information. And so that leads to, we talk about the fog of war, but there's also the fog of management. And so, you're trying to get to the destination that you've set forth for your company. And so bringing some clarity to that fog, I think, can help senior teams quite a bit. So the question is, how do we build a new architecture for productivity? And so I think many of the pieces are there around asset monitoring, the analytics dashboards, enhancing collaboration amongst your teams in the case, and then the case management to support those operations. So lots of the architecture is there, but how do we stitch it all together into viable and meaningful and productive and cost-effective offerings? Now, what's really interesting, and I violated this badge in building this because I actually entered all this data by hand. But what I've done is to try to look at the last decade. We see a bunch of small companies popping up. And so what this captures is the fact that there have been over 40 new companies launched in the last decade dedicated to this space of energy intelligence. And they do a bunch of different things. I include that solar company in here because they're basically harnessing new forms of data. There's some that are looking at end-use customers. They really want to be in the homes, the home automation folks. And then there's others that are doing kind of big picture stuff on scale of cities and things of that nature. But I think what they all have in common is that they're really focused on this space of energy intelligence. And I think over the next decade, we're going to see this increasingly seen as a sector. And companies, we're going to recognize them, and investors are going to begin to get interested in this space because I think there's tremendous potential here. So to kind of bring things all together, what does the next decade have in store? As I mentioned, I think thinking about the age of networks, how do you really harness those networks? Not just one network, but how these networks integrate and interconnect with each other, the digital age, and then finally this enterprise transformation, and how do we transform enterprises to become more productive and efficient going forward. Thank you.
A couple of questions. This first one is interesting because we're getting asked about this all the time, but there's a lot of talk about electricity and gas, but what about water and sewer? How does that fit into this whole topic of conversation? Is it a different story? In other words, how hot is water?
Water is a really tough one. I did actually a lot of analysis on water, and I'll tell you the reason why, is that you look at the International Energy Agency's forward projections of various fuels. They'll tell you that you're going to get X amount of solar, so much gas, and so much coal. And their coal numbers were pretty high. And you begin to realize when you talk to the people actually doing the analysis that they didn't factor water as a constraint into their analysis. So in my view, all of those projections are, somewhat probably misguided, because water is going to be becoming increasingly a constraint in the energy sector. We've seen a number of instances, and it happened in Georgia, where the utilities had new regulations that restricted their water use. They basically kick them off the rivers. And so we're going to see that increasingly around the world, where as the population transitions from 7 billion to 8 billion and a bunch of other reasons, the energy industry is going to have to think a lot more deeply about water usage. And I think that it's a tremendous opportunity. The challenge, of course, is that in many cases, water is considered a social good, not a commercial good. And so it's rarely, if ever, priced on commercial terms. And so that creates all sorts of misincentives in the system. And so what happens is that we saw a picture earlier today about India. It becomes a political driven outcome. So it's a really challenging space of aligning the economics with the scarcity value, and then dealing with the political fallout that happens because of those misalignments. So there's an opportunity. I think the challenge is how do companies and innovators figure out how to monetize this, because it's a tough space to get proper market pricing.
Okay, well, this next question ties directly into what you just said, and that is, for the companies in this room that are many software companies and services firms, what are the implications of everything that you just talked about for those companies that are trying to do just that, monetize their service capabilities and their software assets?
Right. So I think the good news is that increasingly profit pools around the world are going to move into software and data, right? And those that were manufacturers are increasingly going to be commoditized. And so I guess the upside story is that there's money to be had in this space. The challenge, of course, is how do you aggregate it? It's not easy. It's not like just building a game app and putting it out there and becoming the next Angry Birds. It's a tough space. There's a lot of regulation. And so I think the ones that figure that out are going to be in a very nice position, because there's very high barriers to entry once you figure it out and you become successful in the space. But I tell you, the energy industry is it's $1 trillion industry globally, so there's a big money and big opportunity in the space broadly.
Okay, great. Thanks. These are questions from the front of the room. Anyone else in the room have questions for Peter? Yeah, another? Priscilla? How important will it be for companies to collaborate and integrate to develop a well-rounded energy system versus individual companies working to completely own proprietary systems and technology?
If I had another 20 minutes, I would talk about a fourth dimension that I think is really important, and that is the rise of platform companies. And so these platform companies come into a space and become the market integrators, but they do so in collaboration with other firms. And so you have complementers. And so, Apple is a great example, Amazon, there are a bunch of others. Even Microsoft as well, in which you have the core platform firm, but then you have an ecosystem of other firms supporting them. What I'm very interested in, that's why I'm interested in the app economy and others, is what's happening in the energy space with respect to this. Are platform plays possible, and where are the companies that are likely to establish platform strategies in the energy space? Or is it too fragmented, too many regulatory hurdles to be able to come in and replicate what we've seen in some of these other industries? And so I think it's a really interesting question. I haven't figured it all out yet, but I'm on a mission to think that through. So maybe collectively we can figure that one out.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Peter.